Hey everyone, and welcome to That Pedal Show. Dan here.
Mick here, hello.
It's a thing.
Awesome, we're going to get into it. First of all, please go to That Pedal Show store. Think about buying you a t-shirt or some other merch. It's how we fund this show and we massively appreciate it. Also, if you feel so inclined, please click the subscribe button. It does help. It does make us more visible on YouTube. So please click the subscribe button. It's free and we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Okay, we're going to try and stick to the point today, which is unusual for That Pedal Show.
We've rehearsed and everything.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
Well, rehearsed. How to use two amplifiers. Dan and I pretty much always use two amps. And on the shows that we've done over the last God knows how many years, it's pretty much always two amps running.
Always.
One thing that
always
surprised us just recently was we were getting a lot of questions going, how do you use two amps?
Yeah. How do you even start?
Yeah.
Where do you start?
What is the process by which you connect things to use two amps? So we're going to get into that today and explain a bit about that. Why do you want to use two amps?
Because it's awesome. Two amplifiers gives you a color and a tone that you can't get really doing anything else. The way the amps work and couple together, it gives you there's a fatness to it. So you can actually get a massive guitar sound without huge amounts of volume as well. So it's a very beautiful, rich sound.
And there's nothing new about it. Go back to the early days of electric guitar, people using two amps throughout guitar history, whether it's Jimmy, Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan, come through to the modern age, even some friends of ours, people like Phil X in Bon Jovi.
Indeed.
Rich Robinson of the Black Crowes. Just keep looking. If you see more than one amp on stage, there's a good reason for it. It's a great thing to do, and we're going to get into that about why you might want to do it. If you don't want to watch the long video, here are the 4 ways you can use two amps. Number 1, use a Y cable. Accept?
Don't use a Y cable.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
We don't, that's where the cable comes out of here, it splits into 2 and goes into 2 amps. It just causes too many problems. It has been done, you can do it, but we would say don't. Secondly, you can connect, if your amp has 2 inputs, like it's got a high input and a low input, you can use the low input to connect to another amp, and we're going to explain how to do that. All these things have their issues. Thirdly, you might have a pedal on your pedal board that's got dual outputs, either stereo or wet dry. Stereo in something like a stereo delay, wet dry in something like a Boss
CE1, CE2
type chorus, where one side is affected and the other side is dry. You can do it that way. The last way, and the way, if you want to just fast forward to how to use two amps, get a device that is designed for using two amps.
Indeed.
And that might be an ABY switcher. It might be something like this, the Gig Rig Humdinger, and there are a bunch of other things that we can talk about and list in the description. By far, the best way is number 4, a device specifically designed for the purpose. Why? That's what the rest of this video is about.
Very good. We're on it.
We're on it.
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay.
So start at number 1 then.
Well, yeah, Y cable, don't do that.
Yeah. Start number 1. Number 2.
Number 2. The 2 amps we're using today are a Fender 65 Deluxe Reverb. Awesome amp, used on loads of things. And a 2-Rock TS1. It doesn't matter what the 2 amps are. Unless you're going to do it this way. If you look at the front of the Deluxe Reverb there, and we'll do some close-ups so you can see, we're using the Vibrato channel. It's got inputs 1 and 2. It's a high and a low input. What you can do, just going to turn them off for a sec. You basically plug your guitar or the end of your pedal board into input 1, and you take a cable from input 2, and you go from input 2, even though it's an input, not an output, and you connect it to the input of the second amp you want to use.
Very good.
This works every time I've tried it.
Yep.
Word of warning, as you connect it up, set all your volumes to 0.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Step 1, guitar into amp. Step 2, out of that amp into this amp. Going to leave this one on 0. We'll turn this one on, turn it up. We're knocking on the door of problem number 1 there. There's a hum. I'm going to switch this amp on and turn it up to blend it in. Two problems?
Two problems.
What are they?
The two amps are out of polarity with each other. The phase is basically flipped on one amp. So it means that while one speaker is pushing, the other is pulling. So we get this weird mismatch. And the other problem is there's an earth loop.
Yeah, we'll deal with the earth loop in a minute, but the phase is the biggest problem. If you're using 2 amps, you've got a 50% chance that one of them is going to be out of phase.
Indeed.
It just so happens that this particular 2-rock has a feature on it which enables me to flip the phase. So what you'll hear first is the amps with opposing polarity, shall we say, to be
Indeed.
Correct about it.
Very good.
And then I'm going to flip the polarity on the 2-rock and they will come into phase, and hopefully that should be dead obvious in the audio. Have some trying down.
It's a lovely...
The hum is doing my head in, so I'm going to turn the 2-rock down. So the first thing to say is, if your amp doesn't have 2 inputs, you can't do it that way.
Yes, indeed.
You have to use a splitter, which we're going to come on to now. The other benefit of a good splitter is not only will it enable you to get rid of the hum, it will also enable you to flip the phase, and we'll come on to that. So what we're going to do now is employ a device called the Gigrig Humdinger. There are other devices that do this, listed in the thing below. And instead of going into the deluxe reverb and coming out, we're going to go into the humdinger and come out of the humdinger's 2 outputs.
Yeah. So one of the amplifiers is going to have continuity of earth from the cable here to the strings, goes into the humdinger, and the output 1 has an earth, which goes all the way through to the earth on your IEC cable. It's very important when you're using 2 amplifiers. One of them has to be connected to earth. Super important. The other amplifier needs to be isolated, all right? Do not ever disconnect the ground from an amplifier. It has killed people in the past. I'm deadly serious. So the amplifiers must be connected to earth, but as far as you are concerned, you only want one path to earth from your guitar to the amplifier to ground.
And this device enables that. So now we're going to go from the guitar into the humdinger. I'll do close up to this so you can see. One of these outputs is going to go into the amp. The other is going into the other amp. So we've come from the guitar into the humdinger. The humdinger has 2 outputs that go to each amp. Let's see where we are. First of all, we're going to listen for the hum.
There it is.
There it is. And we can just get rid of it.
So
Lovely.
what that's doing is just isolating one side. Yep. And then we can have a listen for the phase.
You will have heard one of those is definitely in phase. To this point of the video, if you plug into 2 amps, you're almost certainly going to have a ground loop problem. and you've got a 50% chance of a phase problem.
Indeed.
And the phase problem isn't always immediately obvious when you stood there in the room. When you hear it recorded, it will be night and day different.
Yeah.
But when you stood there in the room, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to discern until you start A-Bing it, and then you'll hear it very clearly.
Yeah.
It seems like a good time to have a boring bit about phase and polarity. Okay then, phase and polarity. Now people get really, really hung up about these terms, and probably for good reason, because they're not the same thing. Phase is about time, polarity is about wiring, and the terms get used interchangeably, not least by us, which is confusing. And to make matters worse, you'll also see buttons for polarity on a lot of audio gear called phase. Obviously, do more reading online if you want to really understand it, or get a book. Imagine that. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to simplify it for a bit. Now, imagine some horrific universe where the sound that comes out of your amp is a single frequency sine wave like this. For the record, that's not what comes out of your guitar amp, but it does help the explanation. So we'll call this a positive polarity sine wave. That's to say it goes up and down and up and down and so forth. You get the idea. Now, if sine waves don't make a great deal of sense to you, imagine the speaker in your amp moving in and out, up, down, positive, negative, positive, negative. It's no coincidence there are positive and negative terminals on your speaker, right? Now we're going to add a second amp, and good news, we're in polarity. 2 speakers doing that. We can say that the amps are in polarity and they also happen to be in phase. Now what we're going to do is flip the polarity on one of the amps. Dan and I have done awesome dances about this in the past. Push me, pull you. You can see what's happening, right? When they're like this, the 2 waves are in polarity and they're in phase, and the total amplitude of those 2 waves increases. When they're doing this, they're out of polarity and the total amplitude of the wave decreases. Now, clearly this is a massive simplification. What's actually coming out of your amp is much more complex than that. So while the polarities might be able to be flipped, the resultant phase relationship is a lot less well defined, and that's kind of where we get into the problem. Nevertheless, right from the get-go, what we're trying to do is get those 2 amps in polarity. And that is what the switch on the humdinger is for, and anywhere else that might flip that polarity through your signal chain. Okay, moving on to phase. As we said, polarity is about wiring, phase is about time. In this instance, imagine that you've got 2 microphones on the same source. So the way we would mic a guitar amp in our studio, for example. You put one mic close and you put the other mic far away. Well, look what happens to those sine waves when you move that microphone. There is a time delay in the sound traveling from the speaker to the microphone. What that does is it shifts the wave, the resultant sound waves, further along the time axis. And as you can see, the further you move the mic away, the more the phase relationship changes with those 2 waveforms. Remember, one is on the amp, one is far away. That is why engineers spend so long placing microphones on a multiple miking situation in studios, because the name of the game is to get them in phase. Moving those microphones moves through a multitude of different phase relationships. We're not now talking about a 180-degree flip. We're talking about everything from 0 degrees right through 360 in the relative phase of the 2 signals. So the summary of that part is, when talking about phase and polarity, what we're trying to do when setting 2 amps up to work together is get them to be in polarity. Moving on from that, when we mic those amps, and maybe we're using close mics and room mics, we're trying to get the mics in phase.
Well, that was very interesting. Strangely handsome man. So it's important to note that that phase, the polarity change can happen at any point in the amplifier. It can happen at the speaker. But what's more interesting at this point is when it happens on the pedal board. So what we're going to do now, we're going to hook up the 2 outputs from the stereo left and right outputs from a effect pedal and see how we go.
Yeah, this is the 3rd way of doing it, and might seem the most obvious to most of you. You've got a pedal with 2 outputs on it. Easy. 1 amp out of one, 1 amp out of the other. Let's give it a go. Okay, hopefully you can hear that one of our problems has returned.
Indeed.
We are now, just ignore this a minute because it's not in the signal chain. We've now got our ground loop hum back.
Yeah.
Because why?
Because we are connected to the two amplifiers directly from the output of a stereo pedal. So our signal path is going in through here, into here, and then left and right, out of the Nemesis into the two amplifiers. Now, we are joining the earth at the pedal board, and that is what's giving us our earth loop.
There you go. Now, in a pedal such as the Nemesis, it would be highly unusual for those outputs to be out of phase with one another.
Indeed.
However, it is entirely likely that your amps are still out of phase.
Right.
So the first sound you'll hear is Dan's guitar into the Nemesis. The delay is turned off at the moment, so it's just in its bypass state. There's no delay happening. You'll hear what happens when I flip the polarity, should I say? Let's get it right, on the 2-rock.
Indeed.
I'm sorry if this is confusing. It's everything we just described before, except now it's happening off the pedal board.
Yep.
So in a way, we're sort of back to square one.
Yeah.
We've got our hum back, we've got our phase problem back. You could, at this point, employ the humdinger back at the amp there exactly as we did before.
Yep.
Exactly as we did in the first example, except now we're going to have it on the pedal board.
Indeed.
We're back where we were. We're just now going through the whole pedal board, and we're in the same situation we were in. We've still got the hum, and we'll hear if we're in or out of phase or not. Here's how you get rid of the hum.
It's one of those sounds that you can like get used to for a long time, and when it's not there, it's really good.
And let's see if we're in phase.
So the benefits of having a splitter that will allow you to isolate one side and also correct the polarity. It means that in situations like this, you can get rid of the hum and you can flip the phase, the polarity. What's interesting, right, because we're getting the language right, okay, it's very important because there are some silly people on YouTube who have just got it wrong for years. So it's really interesting with the polarity thing is that unless you have a way to A-B it, you just don't know.
Yeah.
Because when you've got amplifiers, unless you have two amplifiers that are exactly the same, set exactly the same, it can be hard to work out what's correct. And, you know, unless you can quickly A-B it. When you can quickly A-B it, then it becomes immediately obvious.
And just to reiterate that point, that polarity flip can happen anywhere. It can happen in any pedal. It can happen in any part of the amp circuitry. It can happen at the speaker terminals. It can happen at the microphone. It can happen at the interface input. If you open up one of your inputs on your interface, or you look at a plugin that's got a little circle with a line through it, that's a polarity flip.
Yeah.
So being able to just flip it back the other way instantly from your board makes a tremendous amount of sense. And you've got rid of the hum.
Okay.
Does anyone want to give up yet?
No, this is amazing. We're nearly there. So it's important to note what we've done now. Instead of splitting at the end of our board, like we were doing with the delay when we had the earth loops, we're now splitting before the delays and before the jam waterfall. Now, we've got that set up as a vibrato at the moment. And something that we do a lot when we talk about doing the TPS wet dry, we call it, is that we split the signal at a point and it goes to one amplifier, and then the signal goes along a range of effects, and then that goes to the second amplifier. Now, you can call it dual, mono, damp, wet, dry, moist, whatever. We call it TPS wet dry because the split signal, the first split signal, comes after your gain stages and it's dry for all intent and purpose. After that, it goes through a bunch of malarkey, goes to the second amplifier, and that malarkey puts the wet signal on. So as a very quick demonstration of that, we've got the jam waterfall set up in one amplifier, and when you kick it on, you'll hear that one amplifier stays dry one amplifier has the vibrato one. So
yeah, Dan will play and I'll turn the amps off and on as he plays so you can hear what's coming out of each amp. Clearly, this is impossible in one amplifier.
the way they couple together, when you hear them individually, you go, and you hear them together, it's like, oh man, it's so good.
A great reason for using 2 amps.
So that, yeah, that's one great reason for using 2 amplifiers, because we can effectively send different things to different amplifiers, right? That's a good example. However, we can run into some problems. And this is something that we brought up and talked about on our viewers' comments and questions on Monday night. And there was a bit of confusion. So we're going to finish on this point, and this is, hopefully this nails it on.
Yeah. Let's cut in a little bit about the difference between phase, polarity, and spice it up with analog dry through. Okay, then moving on to phase, polarity, and analog dry through. We know from the get-go that the first job is to get those 2 amps in polarity, right? Push me, pull you, 2 speakers going in and out at the same time. What happens when we introduce digital pedals, no analog dry through, and latency is we move into the world of time and delay, and we are now dealing with a phase problem. Now do remember, in the context of our discussion, this is only relevant if you're running a TPS style dual mono or wet dry. That is to say 2 amps where the dry signal is present in both amps all the time, and we add the wet effect onto the top of 1 amp. If you're running straight mono, or if you're running true stereo, this isn't an issue. The really good news is the Labrador has just woken up. There's a Labrador the other side of that wall, and it loves barking. Okay, in any digital pedal, there's processing that occurs, right? You've got an analog to digital conversion, you've got processing, and then you've got a digital to analog conversion, and that all takes time. Now, in the case of something like a delay or a reverb, the amount of time that takes doesn't really matter from a phase cancellation point of view, because that signal is not present in the other amp. Remember, we're just talking about putting the effects in 1 amp. So there's nothing for it to phase cancel against, therefore it stays sounding fine. The problem is with your dry signal. Now, if your dry signal is going through pedals that have an analog dry path, analog dry through, as a side note, that's why we're using the new Source Audio Nemesis today, because it does have analog dry through, the previous one didn't. If you've got that analog dry path, you've got no problem with any sort of phase issues through latency with your 2 amps. It's hitting the amps at the same time. If you're using a pedal that doesn't have analog dry through, your dry signal is processed in the digital domain, therefore it goes through all the same processing, the AD conversion, and it comes out the other side, and there is a latency. That latency is manifested by a shift in the waveform, right? It moves to the right, it moves along the time axis, and as we know, we've got one waveform shifting along the time axis and one staying steady. That gives us a phase problem. Now, it's really important to say that you can't correct this with a polarity flip because it's still out of phase when the polarity is upside down. And that is the big deal about analog dry through. That's why Dan and I bang on about it so much. If you've got a phase relationship problem caused by digital latency, you cannot run a TPS style wet dry configuration and have it sound full and fat. It's just not possible. You'll hear some of those examples in a minute. If you do have a pedal that doesn't have analog dry through and you want to run it in a TPS wet dry style configuration, you've basically got 3 options. The first option is to delay the other amp by the same amount. You could do it. If you're so attached to a pedal, you could totally do it. To me, it feels like losing a finger on one hand and then cutting the other finger off on the other hand so they match. It's just, I don't know why you would do that. Secondly, and assuming that you don't want to get into parallel mixers and all of that, which you can do, Dan's Wetterbox does that job, for example, you could run it just wet only, which is closer to a traditional wet dry situation where there's no dry signal present in the wet amp. totally fine. Dan and I just love the balls of having the dry signal present in both amps. It's just such a fat sound. And lastly, if you'll forgive me, you could just put the pedal on reverb and sell it to someone who actually doesn't care. Get something instead with analog drive-through and just improve your life in every single possible way.
So that's the theory. This is how it actually manifests. So we've got 3 delay pedals on the board. Belly Epoch Deluxe, the Mako D1 from Walrus, and the Nemesis delay from Source Audio.
What's super interesting about these 3 delay pedals, this one flips the polarity, but has analog drive-through.
Indeed.
This one does not flip the polarity, but does not have analog drive-through.
Indeed.
This one does not flip the polarity and has analog drive-through. Confession time, we don't actually know for actual certain fact of actualness that the Mako does flip the polarity on the output. It's a moot point, however, because of the latency caused by the digital processing and the no analog drive-through, it's out of phase anyway. So whether you flip it or keep it the same, it's still out of phase. Hopefully that makes the point.
There we go.
You're going to hear them in succession with no delay sound. This is just with the pedals turned on with the delay turned to minimum. Listen what happens to the phase of the signal.
So just to explain that again, we're going to turn the delay pedals on, but with the delay mixed all the way off. So what you're hearing is the pedal without any delay on it. Why is this important? Because the delays are only going to one amplifier.
Yeah, if the delays were going to both amps, it wouldn't matter. What you hear will make sense.
Okay.
Should be, Air Force, should be dead obvious in the audio what's happening there. The Belly Epoch Deluxe flips the phase on one of the amps. The Mako D1 puts it out by a bit, and the Nemesis should stay bang tidy.
Yeah.
To use a colloquialism.
Indeed. Indeed.
Let's prove it the other way. We're going to flip the phase on the amps.
Yep.
So what should happen now is the Belly Epoch should put it back in. The Mako D1 will still put it out a bit, and the Nemesis shouldn't change at all.
Yeah, the Nemesis should stay out.
Stay out of phase, yeah.
Oh, stay polarity reversed.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right, all right.
Well, it is still out of phase.
It is still, very good. Tis conclusive, sir.
That's how science works. You have to prove it both ways. And we don't want to leave you bereft. We'll just get a little sound of the delays themselves. Obviously you don't buy a delay pedal to leave it turned off. Here you go.
Yeah, unless you're us.
I just realised my mistake. Obviously, the first time you heard the Belly Epoch, it would have been out of phase. So it would have sounded thin and weak.
Right.
And then when you get to the end,
It's all, yeah, you flip back in.
Yeah, and it is magic sounding.
With that in phase, it's incredible. Just love it.
We're not going to do too much other stuff today because we've done loads of other videos on things like wet, dry and stereo, and this is the beginning of all of that. So if you want to then go, actually, how do I use this in any sort of practical sense, then go and watch some of our other videos on wet, dry and stereo, and you'll see why do I want to use 2 amps?
Yep.
To get a richer tonal palette, a different feel, sound and response than you can get from a single amp alone. Secondly, to explore things like wet, dry and stereo, and that you can go off and watch another video on that to get more on it. But unless you get this right,
yeah,
polarity, phase,
time-based phase shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ground, earth, loop, hums, all the rest of it isn't going to work properly.
Yeah, you need to get that sorted. But once you get it sorted, it's a beautiful world. It's really great.
We do like 2 amps.
We do. It's a really great thing.
Obviously, there's a million questions coming from this. The most obvious one, what if you do have a Belly Epoch Deluxe on your board and you need to flip the phase when you turn it on?
Great question. What do you do?
It's really annoying. The way I do it is I have an expression pedal plugged in, so the pedal always stays on, and I use an expression pedal to vary the wet level of the delay.
That's a great way. So, and then you change the phase back at the amps.
Yeah.
So at the end of the pedal board.
Yeah. So the phase is what it is,
yeah.
And then the delay can just come in and out. But
right.
There are so many other questions that come off this. I would suggest go and watch more of our videos if you want to get into it anymore. How do I use 2 amps? Like that.
Yep.
Don't use a Y cable.
Please.
If you really want to connect them via the inputs, you can, but you need to be aware of ground loops and polarity. You can split them from a pedal with dual outputs, but just bear in mind that all the problems with ground loops and polarity are still going to be there. And if you've got any digital pedals on your board that don't have analog drive-through, you need to think about the time-based latency effect that affects phase.
Indeed, if you're sending that to one side.
Yeah.
Very important. There we go.
As far as beginner videos go, Dan, I reckon we might have lost them at about the 3rd minute.
Well, yeah, but the people who are into this, this is gold. It's absolute gold. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you got something out of that. If you have any questions, come to join us on Viewers' Comments and Questions on a Monday, where we all get to hang out and ask questions. It's brilliant. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. And also, massive thanks to anyone that's gone to thatpedalshowstore.com and grabbed a t-shirt or strings and pedals, and there's loads of stuff there. It's brilliant.
Do it. It's how we fund the show, and we're very grateful. Also, please subscribe. He said that.
Yep.
Thanks to our preferred retailers. If you click the links down and you see links to some of this stuff, if you buy it, we get a kickback off that. It also helps us, for which we are grateful.
Yes, and patrons, thank you so much for your support.
And more stuff, and more things.
And more
endless things.
It's wonderful. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.